It is early morning in Amsterdam. The year is 1637. A merchant sits in his study, surrounded by ledgers bound in cracked leather. His fingers tremble as he holds a pen over a blank page. Outside, the canal water laps against the wooden posts of the dock. A single tulip bulb rests in a clay pot on his shelf, not planted, not beautiful in bloom, but rendered in precise watercolor. The pigment shimmers faintly in the candlelight. His wife sleeps in the room above him. His children are still young. Before the market opens, before the brokers gather in the taverns, he must decide. Does he sign this contract, or does he walk away? The choice will determine whether his family survives the year or crumbles into debt. In just a few hours, everything he believes about wealth will collapse, and the world will spend centuries trying to forget what happened here. Now, let us return to the beginning. The Dutch Golden Age did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived quietly, through the hulls of merchant ships and the ink of ledgers. In the early decades of the 17th century, the Dutch Republic had become the economic center of Europe, a small nation of traders who controlled the spice routes, the colonial ports, the insurance markets. Money flowed from the east like water. A butcher's son could become a merchant could become a magnate, and a magnate could retire on a countryside estate and collect art, flowers, rare books, anything that spoke of taste and worldliness. The Dutch obsession with possession was not greed alone. It was aspiration. It was a hunger to mark one's place in a new, rapidly shifting world. And no object satisfied this hunger quite like the tulip. If you're interested in the stories that history tries to bury, consider subscribing for more. The tulip had arrived in Europe from the Ottoman Empire during the previous century, passed like a precious secret through botanical gardens and wealthy collectors' estates. But something happened in the Dutch soil that did not happen elsewhere. The Dutch climate, the Dutch obsession with horticulture, the Dutch mania for improvement, these combined to produce tulips of a kind the world had never seen. The bulbs bloomed in flames of color that seemed impossible. Petals striped in scarlet and white, blooms of purple deepening to black at the edges. Some flowers opened to reveal a pale yellow interior ringed with crimson, as if fire burned inside a modest skin. Gardeners spoke of them in the language of rapture. A single prized bulb, one that produced the most unusual striping, the most explosive burst of color, could take 30 years to propagate. 30 years. That meant a master gardener might cultivate only one or two in his lifetime. And when they bloomed, even if only briefly, they became the most envied objects in the household. People wrote poems about them. Painters rendered them in still-life canvases that cost as much as a house. The tulip became a mirror in which the Dutch merchant class saw itself reflected. Rare, exotic, cultivated, powerful. By 1634, the price of these exceptional bulbs had begun to rise. A rare bulb that sold for 100 guilders one season sold for 1,000 the next. The most famous specimens acquired names: Viceroy, Semper Augustus, Parrot's Beak, as if they were works of art rather than plants. And in many ways they had become art. They were objects that could not be touched, admired only in their single moment of blooming, preserved only in paintings and in memory. The wealthy competed furiously to own them. A merchant in Haarlem paid the equivalent of a grand Amsterdam mansion for a single bulb of Semper Augustus. He never even planned to plant it. He simply wanted to own it, to display his name in the ledger as the keeper of the rarest bloom in Christendom. But something crucial was occurring beneath this surface of aspiration. The system of selling rare bulbs was beginning to transform. Buyers could no longer always wait for spring to complete their purchases. Instead, bulbs were being sold while still in the ground, months before they would bloom. A contract would be drawn up. A buyer would commit to purchase a bulb sight unseen, based only on a description and the reputation of the seller. The price would be negotiated, and then, crucially, the buyer did not need to pay immediately. He could promise payment in the future, after the bulb flowered. This was, in effect, the birth of the futures market. And it was constructed not by bankers in a grand financial institution, but by flower traders in tavern corners and marketplace corners, using methods as old as commerce itself. A handshake, a witness, a verbal agreement recorded in crude notation on a scrap of paper. As these secondary transactions grew more common, something remarkable occurred. The price of bulbs decoupled entirely from any relationship to their actual botanical rarity or horticultural difficulty. The value depended no longer on the beauty of the flower or the achievement of its cultivation. It depended entirely on what someone else would pay for it in the future. And if enough people believed the price would rise, then it would rise. Not because the flower had improved, but because the belief itself had made it valuable. A bulb that was moderately striped could be priced as if it were the rarest of specimens, so long as the trader convinced the next buyer that this was true. By 1635, the trading was no longer confined to the wealthy. Brokers emerged, men who specialized in matching buyers and sellers. They took a commission on each transaction. They maintained ledgers of contracts. They organized the chaos of the flower trade into something that resembled an actual market. And as the system became more organized, more reliable, more transparent, ordinary people perceived an opportunity. A baker could pool his savings with 5 neighbors. Together, they could place a bid on a bulb contract. If the price rose, as it seemed to do every season, they would split the profit. No capital investment in land or ships was necessary. No risky voyage to the Indies. Just the belief that flowers would continue to increase in value. And so, they participated. The social geography of the bulb trade was transforming. In the taverns of Amsterdam and Haarlem, in the chambers of smaller cities and provincial towns, men gathered with a new kind of intensity. These were not the traditional wealthy collectors. They were small merchants, craftsmen, farmers, even servants and widows. A weaver in Utrecht had purchased a contract for a viceroy bulb. A widow in Enkhuizen had committed her late husband's savings to a single bid on a prized, striped variety. These people were not seeking beauty. They were seeking escape. They were seeking the promise that one lucky transaction could alter the trajectory of their lives. But the ledgers tell a different story than the one the traders told themselves. The records that survive from the period are fragmentary. Many books were destroyed. Many transactions were never formally recorded. But enough remains to show the structure of the trap. One Amsterdam notary noted in his register that a single bulb contract had changed hands 17 times within a single month. The price had increased at each transaction, but the bulb itself had never been planted, had never been seen, had never actually existed as anything but a promise written on paper. Each transaction generated a commission for the broker. Each commission was a small tax on hope. The year 1636 was the peak. The market seemed to have achieved a kind of perpetual motion. Prices climbed steadily. New traders entered every month. A contemporary observer wrote that, "The love of the flower has come to drive the city insane." But love, of course, was not what was driving the market. Fear was driving it. Fear of missing the opportunity. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being the one person who did not profit from this extraordinary circumstance. Fear is the engine of all markets when they have detached from any underlying reality. The system that had been constructed to manage the flower trade, the brokers, the ledgers, the contracts, the verbal agreements witnessed by multiple parties, was not a safeguard. It was a cage disguised as a system of order. And the system had a single, fatal flaw. It depended entirely on the assumption that someone would always be willing to pay a higher price. That someone, always someone, would enter the market tomorrow with even more money and greater conviction. That the chain would never break. Winter arrived early in 1637. The bulbs were removed from the soil and placed in storage. In the dark months, the traders gathered in their taverns to complete the transactions that had been begun in autumn. A merchant in Amsterdam agreed to purchase a contract at a price that was, by any historical reckoning, astronomically high. But he did not complete the purchase immediately. Instead, he added his name to a ledger and promised payment in the spring, after the bulb had bloomed and been delivered to him. The next trader purchased the same contract from him for an even higher price, again deferring payment. And then another. And then another. No money had actually changed hands, only papers, only names, only the silent agreement that the price would continue to rise forever. But in February of 1637, something broke in the collective psyche of the market. A trader who had committed to purchase a contract at what had seemed an entirely reasonable price suddenly refused to complete the transaction when it came time to pay. His refusal would cost him his reputation and his ability to trade, but he saw something that others had not yet articulated. The price had become unmoored from any relationship to reality. The bulb he had agreed to purchase could not possibly be worth what he had agreed to pay. No bulb could ever be worth that. And once one person refused to complete their contract, the silence that followed was deafening. The market did not collapse. It evaporated. Within days, traders who had been confident of massive profits found that they could not give away their contracts. A bulb that had been valued at 6,000 guilders the week before could not find a buyer at any price. The ledgers filled with canceled transactions, with annotations like refused, unable to sell, contract void. But the commitments remained. The contracts had been written. The promises had been made. And now the traders faced the impossible reality. They had agreed to pay enormous sums for something that no one wanted. What followed was the systematic destruction of fortunes. A baker in Inkhausen, who had borrowed his wife's dowry to purchase a contract, declared himself insolvent. A merchant in Haarlem, who had leveraged multiple contracts against his own property, found the contracts worthless and his property seized. Families that had seemed secure were plunged into poverty. Children were removed from school. Households were broken. And perhaps most cruel of all was the shame. These people had not been victims of violence or natural disaster. They had been victims of their own belief. They had been caught in the trap they had constructed for themselves. The Dutch magistrates and municipal authorities faced an unprecedented problem. What legal remedy existed for a contract that everyone had assumed would be profitable? Could a man be compelled to pay for a bulb at a price that had been agreed upon months before, when the market had been ascending? Or should the contracts be voided? And if so, what would that mean for the reliability of contracts in general, for the entire system of commercial law that the Dutch Republic depended upon? The uncertainty itself became part of the disaster. Traders feared legal action. Courts were reluctant to enforce contracts that seemed clearly absurd in retrospect. And so the resolution, when it finally came, was not a resolution at all. It was a decision to do nothing. The courts ruled that because the bulb trade had been informal, because there was no established legal framework for flower contracts, the courts would not enforce transactions that occurred in taverns and back rooms. The traders would simply have to accept their losses. But the ledgers could not be erased so easily. The documents remained. The contracts still existed, even if the courts would not recognize them. men and women who had participated in the trade, who had signed their agreements, who had promised to pay and then refused. Their names persisted in the margins of other documents. A farmer's mark appeared in a notary's register. A widow's signature was recorded in a tavern keeper's accounts. These traces would follow them for decades. What the Dutch did do in the years and decades that followed was commit the tulip crash to a kind of cultural amnesia. The painters stopped rendering tulips in their still-life canvases. The botanical collectors moved on to other exotic specimens. The wealthy spoke of the crash, when they spoke of it at all, as a temporary madness, a kind of fever that had swept through the nation and then passed. The term Tulip Mania itself did not emerge for more than a century after the crash, and when it finally did, it appeared in the writings of foreign observers rather than in Dutch accounts. The Dutch preferred to remember their golden age in other terms, in the merchant ships, the colonies, the paintings, the civic architecture. The tulip crash was deemed unsuitable for remembrance. It was a narrative that suggested that the Dutch system of commerce, the system that had made them rich, contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Better to forget. Better to move on. Better to let the story fade into legend and half-memory. Yet the traces remained. In the archives of the Dutch cities, fragments of the crash persisted like splinters in an old wound. A letter written by a disappointed investor to his brother, preserved only because the brother had used the back of it for his own correspondence. A margin notation in a ledger of a banker who had refused to participate in the trade. A small note in his own hand that read, "Fools and their money." A court document listing the names of men who had attempted to sue each other over broken contracts, their cases dismissed because the magistrate had decided the matter was too trivial to occupy the court's attention. These fragments preserve the memory of what had been erased from official narrative. The bulb traders of the 1630s had constructed a system that appeared rational and secure, backed by the logic of commerce itself. They had created ledgers and contracts and brokers and rules. They had believed that these structures would protect them. They did not understand that the system itself was the trap, that the creation of order, the formalization of transactions, the introduction of secondary markets, the possibility of trading contracts without ever seeing the underlying asset, had not made the trade safer. It had made it more dangerous. It had created the conditions for a collective hallucination, for a moment when an entire nation's worth of people could agree that an object had a value that no one, in their true reckoning, believed it possessed. The question that the tulip crash poses to us, more than 3.5 centuries later, is not really about flowers. It is about the machinery of belief. It is about the mechanisms through which entire populations can be convinced to participate in a collective delusion about value, about worth, about the future. It is about the gap between the narratives we tell ourselves about systems, that they are rational, that they are protective, that they are designed for our benefit, and the way those systems actually function. It is about the ways in which order itself can become a form of concealment. And it asks us, still today, in every market and every exchange, in every moment when we are assured that this time is different, that the growth is sustainable, that there is always someone willing to pay more. What ledger are you reading from? And whose names are being erased from the pages? The tulip crash was real. The losses were real. The shame was real. The people were real, and their suffering was real. But the memory of it was not. The memory was selected, shaped, forgotten. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all, that the power to construct systems and the power to erase them are the same power. That what survives is not always the truth, but the narrative that is most convenient to those who prosper. And that in every age, in every market, the work of forgetting is already underway.